This is Off Track.
Okay. Well, as Alex just said before we started recording, this Tuesday episode is IndyCar for Idiots. So he rudely insisted that I start it, being the idiot on this topic.
So listen.
As far as IndyCar stuff goes, yeah.
As far as IndyCar stuff goes, you made it very clear last week that you are much smarter than both of us in terms of the history of the United States and probably the globe. But no. So someone by the name of Martha reached out to me on Twitter and gave a very good suggestion, I think. And basically her idea was to create an episode where we kind of hit the most used terms that you might hear during a broadcast, right? That if you're new to the sport, or even if you've been watching the sport for quite some time, like Tim, and don't necessarily understand what it means, James and I have compiled a list of like 10 to 15 items where we're going to try and give you like a brief description of what those things mean, because it's, you know, it's our life and it's our job, and it's not really fair to expect you guys to know some of these very specific terminology. And if you have new people that are also confused as to what these words are in IndyCar, you can direct them to this episode. So hopefully this becomes like an evergreen Off Track with Hinch and Rossi, and it can be a reference guide to the cool words of motorsports.
IndyCar 101. IndyCar 101.
For idiots. I for I.
I see for I. All right. So yeah, we compiled this list. And again, this is something that on the broadcast side, we do a lot, right? We have to try to come up with these quick ways. That's the problem with doing it on TV is they want you to do it in 10 seconds. Explain understeer, explain a weight checker,
always do
explain
it in 10
this, explain
seconds.
that. Yeah, we know. So so this is good because we can go into a little bit more detail and explain some of these things. So let's start with the simple ones, Alex, from the top. Oh.
Well, I think the very first one that Tim kind of brought up that he doesn't know about, understeer, oversteer. So that's often referred to when we are discussing the balance of a car. And so it's really, if you break down the word, that's what it means. So understeer means that you don't have enough steering, meaning you don't have enough power coming from the front of the car, the front axle. And in a lot of ways, you actually are struggling to get the correct trajectory through the corner because you're not able to follow the optimum racing line because the front of the car is not working good enough. Oversteer, on the other hand, is you have too much steer. And the rear of the car or the front of the car is quite powerful. The rear of the car also might be just a little bit weak. And so you're getting a lot of the rotation instead of it coming from the steering wheel. It's actually coming from the rear axle, which is, you know, quite a fast way to drive. But it's also very penalizing from a tire deg standpoint, which we're going to get to. And also your margin for error goes down significantly with oversteer. So some drivers prefer understeer, some drivers prefer oversteer. Both can be very fast in the right hands. But yeah, it's just a way to describe the front to rear balance of the car.
And another way to summarize those, or at least to identify those, sometimes when you hear drivers talking, push is another word for understeer, and loose is another kind of term for oversteer. So if you hear those terms, that's what they mean. And you can also see it, right, on an onboard camera if you're watching a driver. From the apex of a corner off, ideally in a well-handling race car, your apex is your maximum steering angle. And from there, your hands start to open up. And if the hands are opening up at a nice kind of rate as the car exits the apex towards the exit of the corner, that's a well-balanced race car. If you see that they're leaving a lot of steering lock in it, so their hands aren't moving, they're kind of stuck at, call it 12 and 6 with a lot of lock in, that's usually a sign of understeer. Conversely, oversteer is easy. As soon as a driver's correcting, turning the opposite direction, everyone's had that happen in a road car at some point in the snow or whatever, or not in the snow if you're having fun. So that's kind of how you can see oversteer as well from an onboard camera. They also, again, like Alex said, oversteer tends to work the rear tires more, which means you'll run out of rear tires sooner, and some oversteer leads to more oversteer. Likewise, understeer grinds the front tires and usually wears that tire up more. So if you're suffering from understeer, that understeer is going to grow as the stint goes on because that end of the car, tire-wise, is going to wear faster. So that's understeer and oversteer.
I've heard somebody say it once before, and maybe I'm gotten this backwards. It's Like oversteer is when the back of your car hits the wall. Understeer is when the front of the car hits the wall.
That is perfect.
That works.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've referenced this now kind of twice. Tire deg. So that's just another way to say tire wear.
Short for degradation.
Right. Depending on the track / tire compound that Firestone brings, you'll have some tires that wear quite a lot during a stint. You'll have some tires that there's something actually called reverse deg. So the tire doesn't really wear much at all, but as the fuel load comes off, as the stint goes on, the lap times get faster. So deg is measured as a factor of time loss lap to lap. And that's why IndyCar racing can be so exciting, because we have the primary and the alternate Firestone tire. So the alternate tire is the faster, softer tire, but it has more deg, so a shorter lifespan. Whereas the primary tire usually is a little bit slower, but is more durable. But you have to run both in a race. So depending on when you decide to do that, you can sometimes be on the opposite strategy of the guys you're racing against. So some might start on the alternate softer tire, some might start on the harder primary tire, and there may be an advantage there that flip-flops at some point. So tire deg is actually, in my mind, one of the most important elements of making an entertaining race.
It is huge, and that's one of the big challenges for Firestone is you want a tire that's fast and comfortable to drive and consistent to a certain point, but then have deg at a certain point as well. And engineers will talk in deg usually in a time loss per lap. So let's call it half a tenth is your tire delta. It's another kind of term, right? The difference between the optimum lap and where you are after a certain number of laps. So let's say the delta loss is half of a tenth a lap. That's your tire deg. So after 10 laps, it's going to be half a second slower. That doesn't mean it actually falls off a half a tenth every lap. Sometimes you could do 3 or 4 laps at roughly the same pace, but then all of a sudden it takes a big jump and will go 3/10 down in a single lap and then plateau there. So sometimes it kind of goes in stages. Sometimes it is very linear. It totally depends on the track, the car, the setup, the driver, the conditions. But tire deg is one of the most important things to understand from an engineer standpoint, from a driver standpoint, and from a strategy standpoint.
Another thing when you're talking about strategy obviously involves pit stops, right? Most races, all races are really a minimum of 2 stops. Sometimes they're 3-stop races for the road and street courses. Ovals, because of the way yellow flags work, can be 4, 5, 6, 7 stops, depending on the length of the race.
And once back in 2015 at NOLA, we did it in just 1.
Well, okay. That wasn't the full distance, and you won that
sure
one.
Not. It was the worst race ever.
You remember that one very specifically.
At lap 13, win the race.
In the strategy conversation, there's something called undercut and overcut. And this is a little bit of a hard one to explain, but let's reference kind of the point we just made in terms of tire deg, right? And when we're referencing the undercut, let's talk about using the alternate Firestone tire as the example. So that tire is going to be faster, but for a shorter period of time. And so if you decide to start on that tire, the odds are your plan is to undercut, which means you are going to pit before let's say it's a 90 lap race and it's a 2-stop race. That means by simple math, you're going to be doing 3 stints of 30 laps, right? So 2 pit stops, you're going to stop on lap 30 and lap 60 and finish the race on lap 90. That's by logic, the easiest way to divide it up.
On paper, yeah.
On paper. If you're going to undercut, what that means is you're going to come in before that lap 30 time frame, which is fine. But what that means is you're going to see a lot of upside in the beginning. So you're going to see the upside of you're starting on a softer tire when potentially people around you are starting on a harder tire. So you're going to have a pace advantage for a little bit at the beginning of the race. Then you're going to stop before them and put on a new set of tires. And whether that's a primary tire, a hard tire, or an alternate soft tire, it doesn't really matter, because that new tire is still going to be better than whatever tire James is on lap, let's say 27, versus me coming in on lap 21. I've got a brand new set of tire or a 6-lap set of tires versus his 27-lap set of tires. Okay. The problem with that is at one point you have to make up the time in terms of
no
laps.
free lunch.
There's no free lunch, right? So you have to not only save fuel in a stint because you have to still do 90 laps over 2 stops. So one of your stints is going to get extended. So you're not only going to have to go into a fuel save, but you're also going to have to go into a tire save. So it may be an undercut may look really good in the beginning, but it could also come back and bite you as the race goes on because you're going to actually have to slow down to meet your targets. So there's a lot more that goes into that. And I'm going to let James then explain what an overcut is.
Right. So if an undercut, simply put, is you, as the tires wear, you pit early, put on new tires, and can run faster laps for those few laps before the next car pits, hopefully either closing a gap or passing them in the cycle. Overcuts the other way around. And undercuts are very popular when deg is high, because at the end of a stint, you're going very slow and a new set of tires would be much faster. Overcuts tend to be popular when maybe deg's a bit lower, but temperatures are cool. And that's because we don't run tire warmers in IndyCar like you do in Formula One. And so outlaps on cold track conditions can be treacherous and actually quite slow. So it can take a lap, 2 laps, sometimes 3 laps to really get the right heat in the tire and the right lap time potential. Whereas a car that stays out, even if the deg hasn't been too bad, they can run fast lap times for those 3 laps, open up a bit of a buffer, and then they can pit while you're struggling to get up to speed. So an overcut, again, is kind of the opposite. You stretch your fuel, you stretch your tires, and you hope that your last 3 laps of a stint are faster than the first 3 laps of a driver with new tires trying to get up to speed. And then hopefully you can close the gap, maybe make the pass on that cycle. So it's a massive part of going IndyCar racing. And it's not just tires and deg that comes into it and temperatures. It's also a term that we use a lot, which is time lost to pit. So you have a certain amount of time that's different at every racetrack that you will lose from coming into the pits, stopping, getting fuel, getting tires, and then getting down the rest of pit lane. And that is a number that the engineers calculate because it is very important to know where you're going to come out relative to other cars. Because when you come out of the pits, whether it's after, an undercut or an overcut, you want to try to be in clean air because clean air lets you run faster and that's what you want on outlaps. And so the time lost to pit is essentially the number from coming into pit lane, or at least the pit entry, all the way through the service to the pit exit line and getting back up to speed. And it's anywhere from 20 to 40 seconds is kind of the range, depending on the size of the racetrack, the type of the racetrack, and things like that. So that's something you need to consider, because when you're talking about the difference between a 2-stop race and a 3-stop race, the longer the pit lane, the longer the time lost to pit, the less likely a 3-stopper is going to work or an extra stop is going to work. So the shorter pit lanes open up strategy opportunities when there's a fuel gamble between whether it's 2 and 3 or 3 and 4 stops.
So on that topic of overcuts and undercuts, so a lot of you know and have heard about IndyCar has overtake or push to pass, right? Where you get either 150 or 200 seconds of essentially 60 horsepower. So it's literally the mushroom in Mario Kart to use kind of whenever you want. And a lot of people default to assuming that, you're going to use most of that when you're racing another car, right? When you're trying to pass a car, defend a car, or whatever. And while that is true, I would say that you actually use about half of your allotted amount of time to be on the button. So your allotted overtake time you use on in and out laps. So because, these pit sequences are so important, if you think about an IndyCar race and the 25 drivers that are in it, right? 27 drivers, whatever it is now, even if you're first or you're 27th, like the reality of the situation is you're probably running around, 1 to 2 tenths faster or slower than the cars immediately around you, right? So like you're all pretty much doing the same lap times. And so in order for you to actually overtake a car, a lot of tracks, that pace differential has to be over a second. You have to be over a second faster to actually catch a car, deal with the dirty air, and overtake them. But when you think about these pit stops and the in-laps and out-laps, you can lose seconds easily, right? Like it's really easy to have a slow pit stop, and instead of it being 8 seconds, it's 9.5 seconds. Well, for you to make up that 1.5 seconds you lost on pit lane, while it might not seem a lot, if you're only a tenth faster than the cars around you, I mean, that's 15 laps to kind of erase that deficit, right? That's a 15% of the race that's gone. And so what everyone really does is they really work on executing these in and out laps to make the pit stop sequence as fast as possible. And the way to do that is to basically, on every straight coming into the box and every straight coming out of the box, you're going to be on the button. You're going to be using it way more liberally than you would use it, like let's say on a normal lap when you're racing someone. Let's say in that instance, you're using maybe 3 or 4 seconds a lap. On an in lap, you can use up to 25, 27 seconds of overtake. So it's a hugely important tool to kind of minimize your pit sequence time.
And overtake is a boost in horsepower. Obviously, it's about 50 horsepower. It does that by giving you a slightly higher rev limit, because all the cars are rev limited to 12,000 RPM. And then it also gives you a little bit more turbo boost. So that's kind of how they achieve the extra horsepower. It does cost you more fuel, so you have to be heads up about that. And the system itself is pretty trick. You can kind of customize the parameters into how it works. So for example, obviously getting out of a slow corner onto a straightaway, if you're trying to make a pass, that might be the time to do it. You can actually arm the system going into the corner. And then the onboard computer recognizes when, say, your throttle reaches a certain threshold, call it 90, maybe 95%, it'll automatically kick on overtake if you've armed it going in the corner. Likewise, it has ways of shutting off. So you don't want it to shut off once you come off 100% throttle, because think of a bumpy street circuit like Detroit. Down the straightaway, you might hit a little bump that actually lifts your foot a fraction off the throttle, goes down to 97%. You're in the middle of an overtake attempt, and all of a sudden your push to pass shuts off. That's not good. So you build a little buffer in on when it comes off if you're off the throttle. And again, you can kind of customize how and when the parameters are for when it comes on. So it is a pretty unique and clever system in that sense. Now, one of the things we talk a lot about in IndyCar is how drivers have tools in the car. And so there's two main tools, well, three, but we'll talk about two that you hear a lot about. One you have on both road course and ovals and street courses, obviously, and then one you just have on ovals. So we'll start with the weight jacker, which is one you only have on ovals. The weight jacker is a tuning tool that essentially affects the amount of weight across the front axle left to right. And you can either add left front weight, which is something you do to try to make the front sharper, if it have less understeer. So if you're suffering from understeer, you'll put left front weight. If you got a little bit of oversteer, and now we know what these mean, you put some right front weight. And how that works is there's a cylinder that sits on the right rear damper. It's electronic, or it's electric, and it expands and contracts. And so what it does is it essentially pitches up the right rear or lowers the right rear corner of the car to affect the weight across the front axle. So imagine sitting on a bar stool, right? And under the right rear leg of the bar stool, you put 4 sugar packets. Well, it's going to pitch the stool forward, and you're going to have a lot more weight on that left front than you will on the right front. Conversely, if you chopped an inch off of the right rear leg, you're going to sit back on it. It's going to move weight to the right side of the car and put more weight on the right front.
Can I put in a request can we go back and redo all the terms, but make them applicable to sitting in a bar, just to make them more relatable for me? Because I just understood this perfectly.
So an undercut is when you break the seal too early and you pee before your next beer shows up. And overcut is when you start your next beer and then go to the bathroom. So that's essentially what the weight jacker does. And it's a tool that the drivers use constantly throughout a stint, whether they're running in clean air up front or in 1, 2, 5, 8 car traffic. Time of day affects it. How full the fuel tank is affects it. That is a tool that a driver will use on an oval constantly. And we use it in conjunction with the roll bars.
The roll bars, I believe everyone that has a vehicle would probably have been around the term or have heard the term sway bar, right? So essentially what a roll bar is, well, it's an anti-roll bar. it prevents roll. And so what you can do with a roll bar inside the cockpit is make the front or the rear stiffer or softer. And that has a pretty big impact on the balance of the car. You know, it's all to try and manage understeer and oversteer again, but a roll bar can also have effect on brake locking, front brake locking. So if you have a lot of individual inside front brake lock, you know, having a stiff roll bar can be kind of a culprit of that. It can also make the car better or worse ride over bumps. So the stiffer it is, the less roll that is being allowed through the chassis and through the dampers and the springs and the suspension. So if you're on a super bumpy track, you know, that can be negative because the tire won't be able to be, you know, going over those bumps and staying in contact with the ground.
It's not as compliant.
It's not as compliant. The flip side to that is if you're too compliant, you don't have enough kind of support in the car and you can't use the aerodynamics of the car and what the floor is generating. So, you know, there's always this balance between mechanical grip, which is really from the tires and the springs and the suspension, and aerodynamic grip, which is from the wings and the floor and air going over the car. And like we said before, like there's nothing for free, right? You can't say that I want to have a car that's super good and nice and comfy over the bumps, but has a really good aerodynamic platform. Like both of those don't exist. If it did and a team figured it out, they'd win every single race. So, you know, you're always trying to manage this balance between mechanical grip, aero grip, front and rear balance. So understeer, oversteer, and the bars, the anti-roll bars in the cockpit, the sway bars, allow you to adjust that on the fly, lap to lap, corner to corner, stint to stint. And it's really something that, you know, drivers rely upon a lot. Now, there are circumstances where teams can run with no roll bars. There's circumstances where they run with just a front, with just a rear. And when you do that, you know, that could be for the betterment of your overall balance and performance, but you're making that decision knowing that you're losing a tuning tool in the race. Because there's only so many things so once the car leaves the grid on Sunday, the engineer, like he's pretty much done. There's nothing really he can do to help you go faster on the racetrack. It's kind of up to you at that point. So by giving away one of those tools, you're only really left with whatever bar you have on, tire pressures, and the final thing we're going to talk about today, aero balance or COP.
So COP, you'll hear us talk about on the broadcast sometimes, and sometimes T-Bell and I have been good enough to remember that not everybody knows that and try to explain it, but sometimes we don't because you go into driver mode and you just sort of spouting in the middle of a race. So COP stands for center of pressure. And that's essentially the aerodynamic load across the front versus the rear of the car. So you look at an Indy car, you see the front wing, you see the rear wing. That's what generates the downforce as well as the floor and, you know, the general design of the car. But focusing on what the front rear wing are doing, a certain percentage of the aerodynamic load is going to be measured on the front axle and a certain amount is going to be measured on the rear axle. And that's the center of pressure. So you can adjust the COP essentially with things like ride heights and whatever statically when you're back in the garage, but during the race or in pit lane, the easiest way to do that is with the wings. So you can add front wing. That's essentially adding center of pressure. That's moving the center of pressure further forward, putting more of the aerodynamic load on the front. What's up, Brunner? Or you can do it with the rear wing. Again, you can add or take away both front or rear wing. And obviously adding rear wing is going to add load to the rear. Taking away is going to take load off and it'll shift the balance back forward. And again, with the front, if you add wing, it's going to move the balance forward. If you take wing away, it'll move the balance rearward. So yeah, more balance in the front. That's going to make the front sharper, less understeer in the high speed sections of the racetrack. And more rearward COP or less COP is going to take care of the rear a little bit better and make it a little bit friendlier to drive. So those are kind of the tools that you've got. And again, you can do all these in conjunction. You know, the drivers are making these decisions in real time, or let's say you've got a bit of understeer in turn one in Indy. So you add a bit of weight jacker, left front weight, to make the front a bit sharper, but it overdoes it a bit, you can counteract that by maybe softening up the rear bar and finding a combination of what roll bar settings and what weight jacker settings are right for you in that moment. That's part of the trick of being an IndyCar driver, especially on an oval, figuring out those combinations as the race evolves, as your position on the track changes. So the drivers out there are doing a lot of thinking and almost a little bit of engineering while they're also racing at 200 plus miles an hour.
So it's slightly more complicated than put your foot down and turn left?
Go fast, turn left.
Yeah. Okay.
It still comes down to that.
That's the nuts and bolts of it, yeah.
Yeah, the rest is all the nuance.
What I want to know is, so this was 26 minutes of something to help educate Tim. A little bit of pop quiz here. A little bit of pop quiz here, Tim. When would you use an overcut?
When I'm driving an IndyCar.
No, but like what type
scenario?
Of race or scenario or conditions would you use an overcut?
When it was hot, right? No, I don't know. Guys, I got to listen to this like 2 or 3 more times, so I wasn't really paying attention the first
Okay, so
time
after the edit's done, we'll ask you these questions again. We'll have a pop quiz. But yeah, that's IndyCar 101, IndyCar in a nutshell. And
IndyCar for idiots.
IndyCar for idiots. And hopefully it's been educational for everybody. And you guys learned something today.
And if we missed any, you know how to find us. We probably won't do another one of these, but you can complain. That's part of,
Tim loves hearing your complaints. Yeah,
he does.
This has been Off Track with Hinch and Rossi. Off Track is part of the SiriusXM Sports Podcast Network. If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear more, please give a 5-star rating and leave a review. Subscribe today wherever you stream your podcasts. We are at Ask Off Track on Twitter and Instagram. And if you want to follow us on Twitter, we're at Hinchtown and at Alexander Rossi. If you want to follow Tim, though we have no idea why you would, he's at the Tim Durham on Twitter. Find us on YouTube and subscribe to our channel for exclusive video content. Off Track is produced by Tim Durham, and by that we mean Tim.